Talofa lava, and warm Pacific greetings to you all. UTS Multicultural Women's Network and Leia and I would like to begin by acknowledging the songlines, lands, skies, and waterways we are on today. I'm calling in from Mongol lands, and this platform is where we will recognize and honor the traditional custodians of this country and pay respect to all elders from the past, present, and tomorrow. This land was never ceded, and Leia and I are both women of the Pacific Ocean. And so in this podcast, it is important that we honor our ancestors and the waves that brought them here. We also, at every chance that we get, want to acknowledge those who currently live on lands being stolen from under their feet and those who are being oppressed today. Hello, Leia.
Hey, Christine, that was beautiful. I love that acknowledgement. I'm gonna copy it for another event that we do. I'd also like to pay my respects to elders past, present, and I'm coming in from Gadigal land. So this is where I'm tuning in for our recording today. So, as Christine mentioned, I'm Leia, and welcome to this conversation about us just having a chat and exploring our Pacific Island and Asian identities. We're both from the diaspora, growing up in Sydney, and then there's a whole lot to unpack. But just to be clear, we're not authorities on the topic, which also begs the question, what makes you an authority on culture? But we're just two millennial brown island gals, first gen, woke aunties who were born and raised in Australia, living in the diaspora, and we're both going through this journey of exploring culture. And I'm excited because this conversation is just like an insight into Christine and I staying back late in the office and having a good old chat. And I think it's a gift for people to get some insight into that. So, to start off, I want to introduce Christine. So, the beautiful Christine Afoa is the eldest of four girls, born in Bankstown, with family from Lalomalava and Lotofanga in Samoa. She's written for Cordite Poetry Review, Red Room Poetry, and Sweatshop Women under the mentorship of Australia's first ever Pacifica novelist, Winnie Dunn. Her poetry was featured in One Ocean, Many Waves at Shopfront Arts Lab Gallery. And Christine works as a UTS Student Equity Project Officer for the U at Uni Academy and is the Secretary for the Australian Pacifica Educators Network. Hello, Christine.
Hello. And I'll introduce you. Leia is the Senior Events and Engagement Officer at the UTS Center for Social Justice and Inclusion and Marketing and Communications Lead with the Multicultural Women's Network. She's also a freelance artist, Tahitian and hula dancer with Afoa Australia, and performer percussionist with the amazing all-women's Afro-Brazilian inspired rhythm collective Ile Ilu. Her mission is to fuse together her skills and passions and help co-create a better world where historically marginalized communities, especially women of color, can authentically be themselves, take up space, and be free of oppression. What an intro.
Yeah, I wrote that at like 10 p.m. last night. I was like, is this all right?
I love it. I think it's super important to say that you're also a beautiful Filipino woman.
And I would also like to say a beautiful Samoan woman. And I guess it's not really often you see that in people's bios and introductions. So, yeah. But anyway, to kick off this chat, I want to ask by posing to you, what was the inspo behind this beautiful idea of us talking about culture?
Oh gosh, yes. So if you don't already know, America has the whole month of May dedicated to celebrating AAPI, or Asian American Pacific Islander Heritage. It's a mouthful. And we are slowly seeing a shift in the world from AAPI to APID, which is Asian Pacific Islander Desi, or AANHPI, which is Asian American Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander month. And we don't want to detract from the importance of all these different groups, but we recognize that bunching so many diverse groups together means something's got to give. And often it's the nuances of those cultures. It's like what makes them so special becomes muted so that it is palatable for everyone else in the world. And we really, really notice, especially when we're talking late night in the office, that there's nothing like that in Australia. We're not going to start that with this simple podcast, but we wanted to have that chat about what is it about our identities that that is so special and deserves a month of celebration. But even beyond that, we live these lives every single day. A month is just not enough anyway. So let's start this conversation and we'll see what comes from it.
Yeah, I find it so interesting because that's a lot of acronyms. AAPI, APID. I do follow a lot of Pacific Island and Filipino content based in the US. So I see a lot of the AAPI stuff and all the Heritage Month stuff come up. And it is very interesting that we don't have that in Australia, considering how closely tied Australia as this, that la colonial nation state is so like economically, culturally, geographically close to the Asia Pacific region. Yeah, so I do find it interesting, but also not surprising that there's none of that sort of like national acknowledgement.
Yeah, I think it's tied to Australia's really complex and difficult relationship, especially historically with our communities. How the White Australia policy was there and everything that comes with blackbirding and it's just not, we're not at that place yet.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think we forget how the White Australia policy really, really impacted, I guess, the connection of our peoples with this place. And so with the implementation of the White Australia policy, which was the Immigration Restriction Act of 1901, thank you, year 10 history. But they essentially allowed the Chinese migrants who were here from the gold rush era to stay, but then set up this really horrible test to exclude anyone else from entering the country. And so it really was only from like the 70s that Asians, anyway, I'm not sure about the history with the Pacific Islands, but it was in the 70s when they decided, well, not that they decided, economically, they needed a workforce to work in these industries like IT and computer software. And then they were like, all right, we'll let the Asians in. And then that's how my parents migrated to this country. And that's how I guess the first big wave of migration came. That's also, I'm also not including the first wave of migration from the Vietnam War. So yeah. I'm also acknowledging that. But yeah, I guess that's something to point out.
Yeah, just such huge context. Hey. So to hone in, let's talk about ourselves. And what does it mean to you to be Filipina and more broadly Asian?
Okay. Very loaded question. And also like, what is a Filipina? What is an Asian? Like, not to sound, what's the word? I don't know what the word is, but not to like make things difficult to answer, but like, how can you even define these terms? So what I think a Filipina could be completely different or opposing to what another person thinks it means, but it doesn't mean that they're wrong, like that they both could coexist at the same time. But anyway, I will try and answer your question. So I kind of would want to start sort of like in my experience on how I thought about culture growing up.
Mm.
Being like a brown Filipino gal growing up in Western Sydney. But to me, thinking about Filipino culture, I really thought about it really ties me to family. Family, big get togethers, food, big parties, where kids are playing, the aunties are gossiping, the dads are in the backyard. Um, yeah, it's like really family oriented activities. And I think as well, a lot of activities relating to the Catholic Church or that Catholic religion, which is what my family is. And I think it also meant having really nice skin color. They
Yeah.
all be jealous. And I'm like, yeah, the ancestors blessed me.
This melon.
Um, yeah, this melanin hashtag. But I guess in the broader context of being Asian, with Filipinos being grouped in the Asian category, which is also, maybe we'll talk about this later, there's some contention overseas, especially in the US, about whether Filipinos are Pacific Islander or Asian. And I'm like, who created these terms anyway? But I did go to a predominantly white primary school, and then I went to a predominantly Asian high school. So it wasn't just Filipinos, Chinese, Korean, Indian, Sri Lankan, a big diverse group of peers. And I think it, I remember starting school in year 7 and just feeling like this sense of like relief and belonging. And then I think I look back and, being the one of hardly any brown or Asian kids in primary school, like unconsciously you kind of create these things of like wanting to be white, wanting to fit in, wishing your last name wasn't so difficult to pronounce. But I think, I'm very grateful that I went to a diverse high school where like I just like released all of that. Not saying internalized racism just immediately went away, but I did feel, I guess, a sense of just relief and belonging in that context. But yeah, I want to flip it over to you. So, what does it mean to you to be Samoan or Pacific Islander?
Oh, I love how you answered that by going back because it's something that we're working in the education space and we see that in the children that we work with as well. So that's beautiful. I'll also start with going back. I was born in Bankstown, so Western Sydney kid too, but on the other side.
Blacktown, Bankstown, represent.
And I always define it as well through family, just like you. And it's so innate, right? So I'm the eldest of 4 girls, and I've always introduced myself as like the eldest whenever I'm with family. And then I realized that I'm doing that now in my professional life as well. Um, and yeah, it's always the lands that we're connected to, it's the people that we're connected to as well. But to be a Samoan girl, it's like the innate qualities and the values that I've had growing up is just becoming stronger. And the biggest one I can think of is alofa, which is love. And in a Western context, the word alofa would be used, or love would be used in just that romantic sense. But love to me, in the perspective of a Samoan woman, is being kind and being open hearted with everyone that's around you. And that is also linked to another value that we have, which is fa'aloalo, respect for everyone, but also the concept of the va, which is the space that is around yourself, but it's also the distance that you keep between you and others. And it's like I'm relearning as an older Samoan person what that means. But as a kid, you just like have these ideas that you're just like, oh yeah, that's normal. So yeah, I really like that we talked about being children, being little brown kids. I was a little fat.
Yeah. Oh, well, I found it so interesting just now how you spoke about all your like your family and like the connection to land. And in your bio that you know that you sent over, you spoke about being, you know, the eldest of, what did you say, like eldest of four girls and being from Bankstown. And like I've never like I manage events for a living and always am collecting bios, but that's not usual for people to open, you know, with how many siblings they have and where they are in that sort of like positioning, or where they're born. And I think that's really beautiful thing to like bring in that we don't really see often in sort of like this Western context.
Yeah, because often your professional life is so separate from who you are every single day. And that is so strange to me. But of course, I wasn't like always like this. I learned to bring in my culture in my 9 to 5 life.
And yeah, I think that's amazing. And I'm like, I'm aspiring to that, or I'm like, I'm getting there. You know, this is just one example of how we're kind of bringing culture into the workplace and having it be celebrated and valued. I hope you can let
Yeah.
us know after you listen if this is
Like,
celebrated and valued.
yeah. Well, like you said in the beginning, we're not authorities. And I feel like we're not authorities on anything because we're still navigating our way, right?
Which is kind of funny because we work in a university, which is quite a hierarchical place where, you know, research and citations and like there's a very strict hierarchy. And in the academic space, I'm not an academic, by the way. So if you are an academic, feel free to like completely school me on what I'm about to say. But there is this real hierarchy on who is an authority. And like, you know, your opinions or research aren't valid unless it goes through this real Western education process, peer reviewed articles, et cetera, et cetera. And like this whole university institution is a colonial one, you know. And I know there's a lot of work being done to try and decolonize that, but it's yeah, it's you know, I guess we can be some change makers from within, I guess.
Oh yeah, true. Especially all the brown academics that are coming up there. It's like,
Yeah,
so we're making our mark in this space that wasn't built for us, but we're going
exactly.
to make some change. Like that's the best
And
part.
yes, we are. So to kind of go on to something that's maybe not as like cheerful and exciting about, you know, breaking barriers, et cetera, et cetera. But what are some of the like personal experiences that you've had, you know, maybe other people or, you know, other people judging you or having preconceived ideas of you based on your ethnicity or your race or your looks?
Mm. Yeah, this was hard because you don't always want to carry this around with you. Hey, all these negative experiences, but they happen. And I think it's important for a conversation like this, especially because we're friends. So when you're sharing this, it's good to be in a safe space. Um, I remember a time when I was in my first year of university at the University of Sydney, and I picked up ancient history as an elective, and we had an exam that was based on Greek mythology. And on the front page of the exam was a picture of Medusa, and it was where her head was lopped off, so her snakes are like we call it mahana, where it's like all wild everywhere. And I received the exam back, and I got a HD. But on the front page with Medusa's image on in red pen was a moko drawn, so the face tattoo of the Maori people drawn onto the
Mm.
Medusa's image, and the lyrics misspelt of the haka that was popularized by the All Blacks, but is really deeply meaningful to the Maori people. And then in the section where the professor has to leave feedback, she had written, I saw this picture and I thought of you, ha ha ha. And I just remember receiving that, and I had no feedback on the actual mark or the actual exam other than HD. And when I showed my friends, because I was seething, my friends were laughing. And of course, I didn't have any Pacifica friends in my first year of university, which was really horrible. But I just remember thinking, this is a professor at this really highly esteemed university, and she thought that that was appropriate, but also funny. And it wasn't even my culture. I'm Samoan, that's a multicultural thing. And it had nothing to do with the exam. And then I was just really surprised, not just by the actual thing that happened, but the reaction of my friends there. And just as a writer, I write through my work, but also on the side as well. I would get feedback that reminds me of that, because it'll be nothing to do with the actual input of my pieces or the messages I'm trying to convey, but it will always be attacks on me as a Samoan person. So people will be telling me that I should go back to where I come from, even though I was born in Bankstown, or they will tell me I'm not Aussie enough. Or I even had an example where a man was asking people to find my address so he could educate me on being Australian. And it's things that comes up all the time. But yeah, you can't carry that around as much as you carry around the empowerment from your people. But yeah, that's a whole other thing. But yeah, that was my experience.
Wow. I think that just shows how far we have to go as a nation, you know, from like the micro to the microaggressions, macroaggressions that you experience, the power dynamics, when people who are in positions of power, you know, make racist comments and make very inappropriate comments, like you got a long way to go.
Yep. How about you? What have you experienced, or what have you gone through as a grown?
Um, well, I totally agree with you in the sense of like we can't carry that heaviness around, but I think we also need to bring these experiences up so that we can heal them,
Mm-hmm.
because like our bodies and our minds, we carry everything that we've been through in life, and
Mm-hmm.
then ignoring them just doesn't is not the solution, because they will sit with you and it'll manifest in other harmful, dangerous ways, or unhealthy ways at least.
Yeah.
So whilst I know it's really, really important to, stand in your power and look at things from a very strengths-based approach, I think, on a personal level, there's like a huge amount of healing that needs to be done in terms of like sort of acknowledging like things that have happened, or acknowledging how even you've have some internalized racism or things like that. And yeah, it's an ongoing process. But to answer your question, I think, well, I think when people judge me based on being Filipino in a more like positive way, they're like, "Oh, so you're Filipino? Are you a sick dancer?" And I'm like, "Yeah, I am." But then they're like, "Oh, so can you sing?" And I'm like,
Oh,
"Nah,
yes.
fam,
No.
skip me, skip me." And I mean, there's obviously stereotypes of Filipinos being nurses, overseas foreign workers, carers, service workers. Um, but I think when it comes to sort of my personal experience of both racism and sexism, it would have been overseas. And I'm not saying it doesn't happen here, but I think growing up um, in my own bubble in Western Sydney, generally being surrounded by people of color, I was a bit shielded from like the really harsh, intense racism that I know persists and exists in
Mm,
Australia.
yeah.
But when I moved overseas as a 21-year-old to Europe, to Spain, which is also the colonizer of my ancestors' land, that's when I just saw how like epically racist people are. And so I think there was a lot of like catcalling, a lot of racialized um, catcalls, screaming down the street, like gross, gross, gross people. A lot of like jokes about being like a sex worker and like I think my favorite, it's not my favorite, I think one of the first instances or experiences I had when I moved to Spain was going out and then like this guy just coming up to me and being like cuatro euros, and I was like still like figuring out Spanish, and then I was like, did he just say €5?
Yeah.
What a
Ugh.
you know horrible person.
Mm.
um and then I guess another sort of experience I had would be when I went to the Philippines as a late teen slash early 20s gal. And then going to Boracay, which is like the party island of the country. And like you witness that real dynamic of like old men
Mm.
from many different countries, but to me, the what sticks out is like the old white men, and then the very young looking Filipino women, and that sort of real that sex industry really.
Yeah.
And so I think because I look like these women, being who I am and in my skin, like yeah, just the looks, the way people would approach me, people taking photos of me without consent. Um, yeah, it was really jarring and eye-opening. And I think my chip on my shoulder was developed from those experiences.
Oh, sorry, Leia.
You know what? Like it's so common. Just
Yeah.
ask, I think the fetishization of like Asian women, like we all experience it. So like we all know what it feels like. And unfortunately it's a common thing across
Oh.
not just Filipinos, across Asian women from all nationalities.
Mm. It's so hard because like we're saying, you can carry that and it doesn't take away from all the positive experiences that you have with your own community. But yeah, oh my God, that's so hard. I was like, when I was answering this and just listening to you too, I was thinking about how many times we see people from our own community and then it's so normal to stop and chat with them and to share the good stories because we know that we will stop and listen, And I was like, that because I do this all the time, and I'm pretty sure you've seen it. I'll stop and I'll be like, "Hey, my name is Christina Four. Where are you from? Are you from the islands as well?" And then it's like it is so easy for me to carry millions of stories like that, the good ones, and just like
And we
I'll
need them.
yeah,
And we
and
need to talk about our good stories, and we need to be the ones telling them.
yeah,
We can't like we need to stay away from, what do they call it? Trauma porn or
yeah,
something,
yep,
like having the POC up on a panel to or an event or a movie or a film or whatever, and like it being like, oh, look at how hard their
yeah,
life is, where
yeah,
it's like, yeah,
yeah,
we can kind of like take ownership of our stories and sort of express them the way we want to.
yes. Yeah, and on that, so how has your understanding of culture evolved? I know, like big question, big question.
Another big loaded question. Um, so I think I'll have to do a bit of storytelling here, but I feel like especially within the last 5 years or so, like my like understanding of culture has evolved a lot. And I feel like, if we look at a map and the Philippines is here and Australia's here, I've kind of done like a bit of a, scenic route through the Pacific Islands only to get back here. So where that started is that maybe about 7 years ago, I started doing Tahitian dance. I've been dancing my whole life, doing a whole bunch of other styles, and then a friend introduced me to Tahitian dance, and I was like, this is hectic. And I was drawn by like the movement and like how strong the dance is and how beautiful it was. But then I think what what like kept me was learning about the culture and learning about the language and understanding what we were dancing and singing about. And I also started doing Hawaiian hula dancing, and the learning about the culture, language, and the songs. There was so much about like connection to land. It was very spiritual. A lot of really beautiful songs and dances about nature, and a lot of tributes to like the ancestors. And I was like, this is so nice. I'm like, but I can't claim it. This is not my people. And I like for ages, I just had FOMO and I'm like, oh, it's like, this is so cool. Like, I wish I had ancestors. And then it kind of hit me and I was like, well, you do. And
Spawned out.
so, yeah, I was just like, we do. And I think I sort of started to dig a little deeper and deeper. And I think a lot of my understanding of Filipino culture really comes from the colonial Spanish Catholic sort of framework, I guess,
Yeah.
which is like, it's, it is what it is. I'm not shaming anyone for valuing Catholic values or like, doing all of the Catholic rituals and celebrating all of those like special days and things like that. But I think growing up, I never realized that there was something before all of that was like brought to the islands. And then, when in learning Tahitian and hula dance, I have to learn the culture and learn about concepts and things like that. And then I just started making connections. I was just like, oh, the number 5 is the same as the number 5 in Tagalog. I don't know if that's true, but I do remember lima.
It was the same in Samoan.
There we go. And I was like, oh. And then mata.
Yeah, matza.
Yeah. So like all of these like connections started coming together, and I was like, well, duh, we all kind of come from the same like Austronesian sort of lineage. And then I think it just really dawned on me that like, the Philippines was colonized in the 1500s.
Mhm.
And so there was a huge, huge, huge effort to like erase that, suppress that. Um, and like it's starting to come back, I guess, in the mainstream. I'm like, understanding that I'm in the diaspora where we may not necessarily have a lot of contact with. I don't have a lot of contact with you know people in the Philippines. But yeah, I think it's like slowly evolving, and it's going to be something that I sort of figure out throughout my whole life.
Oh yeah. And you're being super humble right now because you're an amazing dancer. To even like go that step further and be informed about what you're doing and how you're moving is just so beautiful.
I think you have to. We live in a very colonial world where it's like to take and to appropriate and to take
Mm.
credit for is kind of the norm,
Yeah.
you know? And like I feel like I'm very cautious in making sure that I'm being respectful and I'm honoring the people that taught me. So thank you to everyone who's taught me. Um and like not taking advantage of something that's not really mine.
Mm.
Yeah. But
Yeah.
so what about you? How has your understanding of culture evolved?
Um, yeah, I like how you acknowledge who has taught you because I think that was really fundamental in me learning about my culture, but also being diasporic is like there's a different element to it, and not having that immediate connection to the land, um, you're kind of feeling like an imposter. At least that was my
Mm-hmm.
experience, where you're just like, am I someone enough? Do I do enough for my people? Can I be as someone as what I feel? um, yeah, and my understanding of my culture was built in the church too. when I was a child. It
Mhm.
was, we used to call Monday to Friday school government school, and Sunday school was the school you focused on. Like all the time, you had to focus on that, and I had to be first in those classes. And I loved that I was brought up that way. Um, how I practice my religion is different these days, but it's still like an important building block to who I am. Um, I think the people that I learn off are people that I met at a later stage. So as an adult, it's the authors that I read, it's the artists that I'm surrounded by, and every single one of them has brought a different side of being Samoan to it too. So I love that. And it was early in university that I read an author called Albert Wendt, and he was so fundamental in shifting my like internalized racism, yes, but also my hesitancy to express how Australian Samoan I am.
Mm,
Yeah, so that was pretty big for me. If that
yeah, I think it's a struggle for us in the diaspora. Like honestly, I get it from people who are very, very close to me. And I know they don't mean to be harmful, but like this whole idea of like, you're not Filipino, you're Australian. And I'm like, well, look at my face. you
mm-hmm.
know? And it's not even that. It's like, blood quantum is a colonial construct. It's just like if you come from a lineage, you are that. Like it's more than this like idea of like percentages or like where you live or where you were born. I think we need to completely shift how we perceive like culture and identity,
Yeah, yeah,
you
that's right.
know. And I still have some hesitation of, you know, being like 100% confident that I am Filipino because I can't speak the language very well. Um, I like, for example, I mean, I haven't been to the Philippines since I was 21, which was a while ago, a long while ago. And I stuck out like a sore thumb. Like, if anything, in that experience, I felt more like distanced or different and not really a part of that place.
Mm-hmm.
But I do feel like if I go back again as a more grown woman, I'll have go back with a completely different mindset.
Yeah, I'm gonna jump in here and ask you then about the labels that you have to describe yourself and how you think about these labels.
Labels. I think when it comes to labels, we need to ask who created the label and what's it being used for. Like being Filipino, like if it comes from me and I'm like, yeah, I'm Filipino, that has a very different sort of context behind someone, a colonizer being like, those Filipinos. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So I don't know how I feel about labels. I'll have to come back to you about that. But I think, yeah, I think it's just important to ask is who created them and what's the purpose of the label and who has agents, like, does this person or community have agency over like these labels?
Yeah.
And so what's your take on it?
No, it's the exact same as a Pacific Islander. I mean, the biggest thing that happens when we bring up labels in the Pacific Islander community is the ones that already exist. And they exist because the colonizers brought them over. European settlers would come in and literally divide the Pacific Ocean. And we had the three main labels, so Polynesian, Micronesian, and Melanesian. And then going back to childhood, Polynesian was the only label that I really heard. And that was because the school system gave us that. And the biggest example was every single Pacific Islander, whether they were from Melanesia, Micronesia, or Polynesia, were lumped together and had to learn Samoan. So that we had a Samoan language class. And I remember the school patting themselves on the back because what a great move to have Samoan language classes. But only the Samoan kids would be excelling in those Samoan language classes. And of course, you've got all the other Pacific Island nations, just like their children would just be failing, and it'll just be another reason why it's not working. But to even look deeper into those labels, the literal translations of those labels were really just um, just really negative, because you have Polynesia, which means many islands. You had Melanesia, which meant black islands, and you had Micronesia, which meant tiny islands. And the thing about it today is, while I'm shifting away from the Polynesian label, I acknowledge our Micronesian and Melanesian families are reclaiming it. So they're finding that these nuances, although put on them by outsiders, is something that they need to be amplifying now. And I completely support that. And I love that about the differences in our communities. But the bigger label of being Pacific Islander, I reckon, especially when someone else is putting it on you, they will just latch on to whatever the most well-known example of that label is, right? And if you think of Pacific Islanders, straight away you think of really high-profile sports people, or people in tough arenas like wrestling or boxing. You've got The Rock, whose Matai name is Sayuli, but no one really knows that anyway. And it's always our men who are the face of it. And they're brilliant people, and they're doing brilliant things in the world of sport, but we're way more nuanced than that. And we've got the women too who are in these fields that don't have that level, they don't have that weight to their own label. And I reckon it's changing. I reckon it's shifting, and we're seeing women thriving, like Pacifica women thriving in academia. We know so many great people in our workspace that are like that, and like STEM, in the arts. And yeah, there's it's time now.
Yeah. And it's one of those things where you don't want that label, especially if it's imposed by you from like the outside, to just become stereotypes. Yeah, I feel you on that, girl. I think when you were speaking about sort of like these arbitrary borders and labels that were imposed by settlers, kind of reminds me of the Philippines. So some fun facts about the Philippines. One, Philippines was named after King Philip II of Spain. And so, the settlers decided to come in and be like, and they arbitrarily drew the borders as well. Like before that, we were just hundreds and hundreds of different cultures with different rituals and languages. And, like what's the difference between the Philippines and Indonesia? Like we're so close, but like these arbitrary borders were created. And then they called it Las Islas Filipinas, which is like the Philippines. And then the second fun fact, Filipinos originally weren't even like the native people. So the Philippines had a real caste system, and it basically went from Spanish born, Spanish blood at the top, indigenous at the bottom. And so a Filipino in its original context was sort of like a little bit here, and they were full Spanish blood people born in the Philippines.
Wow.
And then people like me, who comes from the Austronesian sort of lineage, we were like towards the bottom. And then this is was used as a derogatory term, but they referred to us as like the Indios. So using the word Filipino, when you look at its historical context, it wasn't for us, but it is an act of reclamation and ownership of that term, which now spans across all of the islands. So yeah, and I only learned that recently. Thank you, Instagram. Thank you, content creators.
Oh, now we're learning too. I'm pretty sure other people knew this already, but I'm like, thank you, Leia. Oh, that's
Oh
huge.
my goodness.
Traveling the world and traveling history. just with this conversation out of that?
Well, you know, it just shows me that the Pacific Islands has a lot to offer, you know?
Hmm.
So I'm not mad about having like a detour through the South Pacific to get to my Filipino identity.
That's beautiful.
I'll take it.
Yeah, that's beautiful. And it's how you were meant to travel it. It's how you were meant to navigate this journey. And no one can tell you otherwise, honestly.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't choose it. It just sort of happened and I'm just kind of just going down that path.
Hmm.
Well, we've had
Mhm.
a pretty good convo. Was there anything else you wanted to add?
Um, no, I feel like even if we look at this podcast in the future,
Mm.
we will be somewhere else in this journey. And
Oh, 100%.
yeah, we'll be learning so many more things about our own cultures, our own the labels that we have. And I hope that whoever's watching this feels inspired to take that journey too. And I hope they know that there's no wrong way to navigate this path. And there are so many ancestors before us that had to do this too in their own different ways, but we're here.
Mm. And
We're
I think something beautiful I saw on Instagram from this amazing lady that I follow. And I'm actually going to just bring it up now so that I don't butcher her words.
here.
Um, and you know, I think there can often be like this element of guilt or shame of like, oh, why didn't they, you know, why didn't they like follow their culture? But honestly, it was like, okay, she says, our ancestors did not die for nothing, did they? Our ancestors disconnected from their culture for survival so that we could thrive. And also, that's not her exact lines because, like, the captions just changed. But that was something that I saw the other day, and I was like, you know what? I honor that. I honor them.
Yeah. Oh, I love that. That's good. That's what we're doing in our work. We're
Hmm.
in this as well. Oh, beautiful.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a good place to wrap it up. I feel like we could have dived a lot deeper into many of the topics that we spoke about. Maybe we could do a round two at some point. But
No one's this except for us.
even if it's just us, I'd be like, yeah, and I'll listen to it and be like, okay.
Thank you for
Um, thank you too. This was really fun. Thanks for the idea.
no. It was something that we always talk about, and not just between ourselves, but within the Multicultural Women's Network and the wonderful women that are there too. We have our own like inspiring mentors too, and Elaine and Amanda. So I think it's so important that we keep going for the next generation of aunties, not yet mamas, but
They're coming through. We ain't 20 years old anymore. Oh, well, this was awesome. It's kind of made my afternoon, made my day. So there's going to be a lot of great stories and some other great content coming from the UTS Multicultural Women's Network. And so if you're listening and want to know more, you can just check us out at uts.edu.au/MWN. And then that's our website, and you can just check out the cool stuff that's happening around the space.